Hi, Barry. It's so great to have you on the show today. Thank you for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
The more I looked into your background, and it really reinforced why I thought this would be a great conversation because you have really a lifetime of sales mastery in various versions of your own companies, of other companies, and it looks like finally you decided to lay claim to it and name your company Sales Mastery. So share with us if you would, what's your story? How did you get from where you started to where you are today in this?
Um, okay, the story ended when I got out of college. All my jobs through high school and college were sales jobs, and then I graduated in engineering and made the mistake of going into engineering.
Ah,
So I did that for 5 or 6 years. I worked in underground construction and worked in
yeah.
municipality. Got registered as a civil engineer and decided what I really wanted to do was sell. And so I went into the private sector selling engineering services.
Yeah.
And from there, decided I just wanted to go purely into sales, that I wanted straight commission, all of that. And
That you wanted straight commission.
yeah,
You're not, you've got to be whatever some very tiny subset of the 1% is in terms of people in that position. I think that's amazing. But don't forget your train of thought here. But I got to ask you, why did you go into engineering? Was that like a family business expectation, or what was the
I,
reason there?
I thought my dad wanted me to go into engineering, and
You
he
thought
claimed
your dad.
after he claimed years later he never wanted that, but I don't think that was true. He worked for a utility and
Okay.
always looked up to engineers, and I think the proudest day in his life was when I got registered. So
Wow.
um,
Well, certainly a worthy calling, but so is sales.
yeah, yeah. In my view, yes, sales is terrific. And anyway, uh, I went to work for a mortgage broker because he was a self improvement nut. When I left engineering, I looked at commercial real
Mhm.
estate, computers, finance, and headhunting. And I went to work for this one guy because he really was a self improvement nut. And if you've ever heard of Jim Rohn, he was a big fan of Jim Rohn, who was Tony Robbins' mentor
Oh
and
my
model.
gosh. Okay.
And I went to work for Jerry, got excited about self improvement, journaling, goal setting, all of that stuff.
Mhm.
That went on for about a year and a half. Timing in life is everything. That was back in the early 80s when the prime rate crested 20%.
I remember it well.
Not a
Yeah.
great time to be in the mortgage business, but in any event,
Gosh.
from there went into doing my own speaking on sales, and then went to work for Miller Hyman, and I was with them for about 9 years. Worked
Mhm.
with Bob Miller, writing and rewriting each of the programs they had back then, and Steve Hyman, was they were both active in the business. I was like the son born of those two fathers. I think I was purer Miller Hyman than either Miller or Hyman.
Wow. Wow.
Did that for 9 years, became president of Miller Hyman at one point. And then when Steve bought Bob out, it made sense for him to run his own company. And so I
Yeah.
then became an associate. Uh, Went into my own doing sales process mapping, and then joined forces with Joe Vavrica. And we
So
started
that
a
engineering training helped you a little bit with the process, I'm
It
guessing.
absolutely did, and it really informed the next step, which was starting Salesware, which was a software company
Mhm.
doing what we called pipeline performance metrics. Now they call it analytics. And so that company was acquired the very end of the 90s, actually the very beginning of 2000. I think we closed that deal January 4th of 2000.
Mhm.
We were acquired by a company called Goldmine, and worked for them for a couple of years, became president of the gold mine. I was VP of North American sales for gold
Mm-hmm.
mine,
Uh-huh.
and then became president of the gold mine division, and then went out on my own and then joined forces with Jim Dickey, who we had hired as an advisor to our software company, Salesware,
Mm-hmm.
and so Jim and I partnered up in 2002 or so, and started doing research with CSO Insights, Chief Sales Officer Insights, and that company was acquired coincidentally by Miller Hyman Group in 2015. We had
Mm-hmm.
a couple of year earnout. Everybody did what they said they were going to do. We met all our performance hurdles, and then in 2017, beginning of 2018, we started Sales Mastery,
Okay.
and that's where we are today.
But uh, you've kept the research continues in some version. You know, the research
Yes,
one.
so we did research. That's what CSO Insights was all about. And then
Yes.
when we were acquired, we merged CSO Insights with the Miller Hyman Research Institute. And I got to be chief research officer there for a couple of years. And then when we spun out again, or when we were back out on our own, we were doing research in two specific areas because, we didn't really want to compete and there was no need to do so.
Yes.
Um, we focused on AI for sales uh,
Oh
and
wow.
sales as a profession. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's where we focused for the next, 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. You know, I want to go back to your point about your peak. Was it peak performance metrics,
Hmm.
and which is today called analytics? I think peak performance, or do I have that? Am I remembering that correctly? What
No,
was
we
it
have three
called? It,
performance levels that we talk about.
but I
Uh,
think that your name for that analytics was far better than just the word analytics because it was very clear.
oh, we called it pipeline performance
Pipeline
metrics.
performance metrics.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't get that
No,
right,
that's
but
fine.
it's so purposeful and so clear what it to what end, as
Hmm.
they say, versus just analytics sounds like, it's just something. But anyway, just an observation of part of your purposeful life here. Uh,
Well, and we did some things then that they still aren't doing, which I think is amiss. We not only, did forecasts, but we looked at best case, worst case, and so
mhm,
on,
mhm,
most optimistic, most
mhm,
pessimistic, that sort of thing.
mhm.
And uh, I think that there's still plenty of room for improvement in
Yes,
that area and
and we see
forecasting
that.
in general.
Yes.
We
Oh,
say that forecast accuracy is an oxymoron,
yes.
so
Yes,
and remains
yes,
that way.
yes, for sure. Well, share this, talk a little bit more about this study that you do and what some of the key, perhaps perennial or new insights coming out of it.
Sure. So we, uh, Jim was doing research starting back in the early '90s,
Yes.
and produced a report called, I think, toward toward the year 2000 or toward Y2K, if you remember that
Okay.
Y2
Yes,
way back
yes.
when. But when we teamed up in 2001, um, we were doing phone interviews. We actually were calling people and doing interviews. And if you got 100 or 150, I mean, that was really something. And if you do remember 2001, 2002, that's when the tech bubble was inflating
Mm-hmm.
and everybody was going crazy, and getting people to take the time, to to answer survey questions by phone was remarkable. In 2004, it was the first time we did an online survey with
Mm-hmm.
SurveyMonkey, and it just took off. We had like 400 responses, and it was really terrific. And we've been online ever since. The thing that Jim said when he started doing his research way back when was, uh, you know, marketing people, there was research for marketing,
Yes.
Executives could talk to the, YPO or the SEC, the Sales Executive Council. But there was nobody doing research for chief sales officers. He had
Mm-hmm.
no charts.
Mm-hmm.
And, and so that's really what we were trying to provide. And our guiding light was Edwards Deming, who was the father of the quality movement.
Sure.
His
Mm-hmm.
great quote was, "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion." And that's fine. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but when it comes down to making decisions, having data,
Yes.
is really helpful. And so we started gathering data and have had several hundred responses every year to our survey, sometimes more. The things that um, I would say have not changed are forecast accuracy is still, a joke. And I can say more about that in a minute. Process implementation has improved, but is still lagging. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Coaching, very positive in our culture,
Mm-hmm.
but is not really um, formalized, is not rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
And the room always gets quiet when we ask who's coaching the coach. So
Mm-hmm.
those are some things that have not changed.
Mm-hmm.
Things that have changed, certainly technology has evolved. User adoption remains, a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been an unwarranted belief in or reliance upon technology.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
and I think the whole SDR, BDR model is, I just think it's nuts. I think it's upside down. You have
Hmm.
your least experienced people doing the heaviest lifting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And your most experienced people typically taking care of existing major accounts.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
We have a couple of videos on that. Um, and I think one of the things that has changed, and I think has changed for the better, there used to be sort of this bright line. Pre-pipeline was marketing, and once it was in the pipeline, it was sales. And
Mm-hmm.
they were always kind of pointing the finger at each other. You know, sales saying to marketing, "The leads suck," and marketing saying to sales, "No, you suck." And I think what has happened um, is now, with so much being done online, a lot of times that's really managed by marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's more of an illuminated rather than a bright line. I think there's an illuminated portion of the pipeline that marketing is still involved in. I think that's been a change. Certainly, the biggest change, no question, and maybe I should have mentioned this first, is the power shift from the seller to the buyer.
Mm-hmm.
Before the
Yes.
internet, the guiding principle or one of the maxims was product knowledge is a salesperson's greatest weapon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what?
Yeah.
Buyers have all of that information before they ever talk to a seller now. And so I think the shift from um, the sellers having all the information, pricing and product availability and features and function and all of that, and is now in the buyer's hands. And when we were doing process mapping in the 90s, it was, I guess, what I would call inside out. We would look at, the sales process and what is the buyer doing at each step
Yes.
along the way. Now it's more outside in. What is the buyer's journey? What is the buying process? And are
Yes.
we aligning our sales motions with that?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
a huge change.
Yeah. So.
Um, Surprisingly, the metrics themselves have not changed remarkably. The highest I think we ever saw was 63%, 61 or 63% of reps meeting or beating quota, and low 90s, maybe 92 or 93% of companies making plan. On average, that's across all.
Yes.
Uh, we can come back and talk about the three performance levels. Um, and reps making, well, I already talked about that. Forecast accuracy,
Yes.
some typically is in the mid to high 40%. And that's of deals that are forecast. I mean, that's
Yes, yes.
ridiculous. I mean, literally, you could do the same thing flipping a coin.
Mhm.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I,
So I
I,
think those are some of the things that have remained the same, some of the things that have changed.
so in reading your report, I remember seeing a small but mighty graphic that really showed these. I don't remember if it was 4 or 5 or 6 different dimensions, and then those companies that got it right, so to speak,
Hmm.
versus those that didn't do it, and
Hmm.
significantly different performances of the company. Can you
Right.
speak to that a little bit? We're talking to, our listeners, by and large are CEOs of companies. What is
Hmm.
it that you might share here that could really underline what needs to be done differently to change the
Yes.
trajectory of
Well,
the curve up and to the right?
yes, no question. So the chart you're talking about is the what we call the sales performance scorecard,
Mm-hmm.
which we first introduced in an HBR article that came out exactly a year ago. It was the November-December issue of 2022 Harvard
Mm-hmm.
Business Review. But I'll go back in history a little bit. Um, starting in the early 90s, I was talking about levels of relationship, uh, vendor, preferred supplier, solution consultant, strategic contributor, and ultimately trusted partner, trusted advisor.
Mm-hmm.
Jim wrote an article for Forbes in 2000 on levels of sales process. He had 4 levels: um, ad hoc, informal, formal, and dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting, I said we teamed up in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
It only took us 5 more years to figure out we could put those together in a matrix. We
But
finally
you
did that
have.
2006 or 7. And we had 4 levels of sales process on the horizontal axis and 5 levels of relationship on the vertical axis. And what we found was as you moved over and up in the matrix, things got better.
Yeah.
One of the things we talked about, before the podcast, it's all self-reported data.
Yes.
And so a lot of these metrics that we're tracking, conversion rates and
Mm-hmm.
um, sales cycle length and user adoption, all that stuff are really educated best guesses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the good news is when you have several hundred, that
Yeah.
normalizes. So you do
Yeah.
get at least
Yes.
directionally correct. But
Yes.
the metrics we use for the matrix are not guesses. The metrics that we use are revenue plan attainment,
Mm-hmm.
percentage of reps meeting or beating quota,
Mm-hmm.
outcome of forecast deals, one lost or no decision,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
rep turnover, voluntary, involuntary turnover. Those are not guesses. Those are
Yeah.
things people actually track
Yes.
and have
Yes.
data on. And what we have seen over now, uh, 17 years,
Mm-hmm.
is the data completely supports higher levels of process implementation, higher levels of relationship,
Mm-hmm.
higher levels of plan attainment, higher percentage of reps meeting beating quota, lower turnover, and greater forecast accuracy. All of that is available in the report, and in the summary we can provide links. People can download those.
And we'll for sure have it in
um,
in the write up for this
what
episode because that's
changed
important.
oh,
We'll include
I'm
that in
sorry.
the write up for this episode because that's
Oh,
really important and
terrific. Yeah,
insightful
great.
information.
The 2 things that have changed and what came out, what we did with the sales performance scorecard, is we added a 5th level of sales process
Mm-hmm.
to reflect artificial intelligence and machine learning in sales.
Mm-hmm.
So we now have um, ad hoc, informal, formal. We also renamed it to agile, and then added a 5th level of process, customized.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are now the 5 levels of process. And the 5 levels of relationship, we redefined 3 of those. So it's now transactional vendor as opposed to just approved vendor, preferred supplier, solution consultant, strategic collaborator,
Hmm.
and trusted co-creator. And
Oh,
we
wow.
think that those other labels really truly reflect this change in dynamics between
Yes.
the buyer seller relationship and equation.
Yeah. So that sounds really powerful. And I can think of many examples of where, you know, the the transaction, and test me on this, coach me here, but where the transaction may actually be, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. The transaction may be you actually got the engagement, you sold the deal, you got the engagement, you're working this, whatever this professional service is being provided, and then suddenly they're a former client,
Hmm.
and now it becomes okay, let's do an email outreach to former clients and say ABC. And then a little bit later, oh, let's do another email outreach or place a call and invite them to a webinar or event. And oh, let's use this, tool to create another conversation. But that to me is transactional. It is not part of a fully framed way to outreach and stay connected to the existing clients you have. So would you say that these things in the funnel also apply, these insights and learnings in the sales beginning end of the sales cycle also would apply to staying in touch with and continuing to appreciate former clients?
I think staying in touch absolutely is one dimension of the
Hmm.
strength of a relationship. And um, the the level, the volume of business you're doing is another dimension. But it's
Hmm.
not strictly just dollar volume. You can be doing huge sums of business with people, but
Yes.
if it's transactional, rapid, repetitive, routine, that's still transactional. And
Yes.
there are things, we have a video on this, levels of relationship. There are things that increase as you move up through levels of relationship:
Hmm.
access,
Hmm.
repeat business,
Hmm.
referrals. Um, and when I say access, that also means within the account.
Yes.
So
Yes.
cross-selling and upselling, account penetration, and so on are all reflections of the relationship. There are things
Yes.
that go down as you move up in levels of relationship, things like price sensitivity, the important significance of features and functions of your product, the
Hmm.
number of folks you compete with. At the lowest level, you compete with everybody. At the highest level, you may be helping them select other
Yes.
suppliers.
Yes.
And so it's really a very rich,
Yeah.
uh, and to me, it's the whole essence of selling is establishing and elevating relationships over time,
Yes.
so that these things are working in everyone's favor.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that is a great comment, and I can't help but wonder across the span of companies and sales person, and this is would be part of marketing and customer service and client ambassadors and so forth. But what is the likelihood
I
that
think the
these
other thing
things
that's
will
worth
happen?
mentioning is, talking about levels of relationship, but levels of process. Uh, the good news is and if I'm speaking to CEOs and sales leaders, the good news is you have control over that.
Right.
You can't control the relationship. I mean, you show up, there are things you can do in terms of adding value, being consistent, not just doing these periodic
Hmm.
technology outreaches, but actually showing up for a relationship. But
Hmm.
it's still not everybody wants to partner, not everybody wants to collaborate. They just want to have you show up, deliver the goods on time and within
Yes.
budget, and get lost. Okay, so
Yes.
that's how we want it to be. But with respect to process, you have complete control over that. And the fact that companies continue, and I looked up the figures um, for Chief Outsiders market, 51 to 250 million.
Yeah.
Um, uh, 9% were ad hoc, 36% were informal, and so that's 45%. Nearly half are at the lowest levels of process implementation,
Yes.
and another
Yeah.
24% at informal.
Yes.
So, two-thirds of companies are, barely enforcing or reinforcing, introducing sales process.
Yes.
And that's just a huge miss. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's not an opinion.
Right.
That is absolutely supported by the data over
Right.
thousands of companies and almost now 2 decades of gathering this data,
And yet, when you
17
think
years
of
worth.
it, when you think of it,
So
how much
I
money?
think anyone who's resisting that is not paying
Yeah.
attention. I just say I don't think they're paying attention.
Yeah. And there it seems like there's more than the opportunity lost by not doing the process that you suggest. There's also money being spent by marketing departments to drive leads into these sales processes that are deficient. So you could have either or both sides of a coin ineffective in a company.
Yeah, this is funny. You keep freezing up on me here. But the one thing, when you talk about the money being spent on both sides, the
Yes.
old line is the CEO saying, "I know we're wasting 50% of our marketing budget. I just don't know which 50%." Um, we actually, I've done a video on this as well. They're all on our YouTube channel, by the way. But along perfect prospect profile, and if you look at any normal any population, you're going to have a normal distribution.
Hmm.
And half of these people are favorably predisposed to working with you. And
Yes.
half of these people are not. They'd rather work with the competitors. And yet we tend to treat them all the same. And, I would say this half that doesn't really like you and loves your competitor, that
Yes.
may be the 50% to look at that, is not being well spent. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a place to start anyway, for sure. And I'm sure in your work, the CMOs, the chief outsiders has out there. I'm sure many of the companies, when they first start working with, have not identified we
Very
call it
true.
perfect prospect profile.
Yeah.
Miller Hyman, and the term that's been more, I think, universally adopted, ICP, ideal customer profile. You
Yes.
either have that or you don't, and you've either looked at it in the last 18 months or you haven't.
Yes.
And and really, if you're not doing that, I mean,
Yeah.
really, you're just throwing stuff against the wall.
Right. Right. And then I don't know, hopefully I'm not freezing up as much, but then if you spend that money, let's say you even get that perfect, right? You're
Yeah.
perfectly targeted, and then you send it into a sales process that is utterly deficient. So what are the two or three things that you suggest a CEO do really now to ensure that they can capture more business and build relationships more towards the top of that relationship matrix?
Well, I think there are two things. Number one, I think one of the things, and I used to say this when I was doing the Miller Hyman training, I think it was unfortunate labeling. Us calling it perfect prospect profile and back ideal people, when we would go through the exercise, people are saying, do you want ideal or do you want real?
Oh.
And
Oh.
and it's like, this is like the Boy Scout oath, kind, courteous, loyal, honest. They're not perfect, okay? We'll take, but what you want is some way of grading, of judging not just the demographics, but the psychographics that are well suited to us. And
Mm-hmm.
um, as the old expression, birds of a feather, flock together. Well, birds of a feather tend to do good business together and tend to
Mm-hmm.
want to have relationships together. And if you're not well suited, you're really kind of shoveling against the tide here. And you don't need to do that. There's so much out there
Yes.
if you really do begin to target and decide how, we're going to spend the majority of our money with these folks, and the some more of our money with the secondary and the tertiary, we'll try and warm them up with technology
Hmm.
and lower cost outreach,
Hmm.
but let's not treat them all the same. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. So on the marketing side and on the sales side, um, the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think a better interpretation is do unto others the way they want to be done unto. you
Yes.
know, this this is how I want to interact with you. This is what I want from you. And the whole notion of adding value and calling high, again, there are videos on our YouTube channel for this. But what people want is, tell me what I don't know,
Yes.
or confirm what I think I do know. And the Mark Twain quote we used for this year's study is, it's not the things that you don't know that get you in trouble. It's the things you know for sure that are no longer true.
Yes. Yes. Oh, wow.
And and I think that there are a lot of folks operating on certainty about things that are just have really changed. Going
I
back to the question you asked earlier.
I completely. I think that that is a huge point, and then perhaps the question, to the audience, and maybe this is a good end note for this episode. Is it what is it that you know for certainty that may just not be so? And so, can you give us that quote one more time, Barry? The Mark Twain quote.
Sure. It's not the things you don't know that get you in trouble. It's the things you know for sure that are no longer true.
I just think that that is a perfect bit of fear, doubt, and suspicion to leave our audience with today. And you have a lot of information
My guess
in.
is we're going to be re-recording this,
Yes.
but we'll see how
Yeah.
the Riverside folks are able to put this together. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much. I think your study is very powerful. The wisdom and the insights that you derive not only from your study but from your experience and your partner's experience and all this. And I really appreciate your dad setting you off on an engineer foot that turned into an
Well, it was a
extraordinary
great education.
that turned
It
into
just
an extraordinary sales mastery. So thank you for joining the podcast today. This episode is great, and I look forward to being more in touch in the future.
Well, thanks for having me in. My pleasure.
You're welcome.